Dear friends, I would like to welcome you all and thank you for patiently waiting for us to begin with our webinar today, which we consider to be very important at this time. I believe you will be right with me if I depend on my paper here for the introduction, because I do not want to miss anything that is important. My name is Tihomir Kukolja, and I'm a former director of Renewing Our Minds Ministry, and I'm currently the editor of this new wonderful feature, which we call face-to-face conversations or webinars. Today, our panelists, all of them Christians and followers of Jesus, who I shall introduce very shortly, will wrestle with some probing questions of this moment when America stands bitterly divided and the world is watching, confused, wondering, and asking, what has gone wrong with America? Some of the background questions that have led us to this webinar are, why are so many American Christians actively contributing to the division instead of to healing? Do truth and integrity matter anymore? How should our Christian faith inform and guide our political and socially engaging decisions and actions? Where has healthy critical thinking gone? What would happen to the leading and believing beyond 2020, regardless of who wins the elections? And finally, what has gone wrong with a kind of Christianity that endorses political confusion, hate, discrimination, racism, lies, and the wildest conspiracy narratives? Today, we will try to give you an international perspective. Why? Non-Americans who demonstrate a higher level of interest in the American affairs at this time are often asked, why do you bother about who is going to win the elections? Shouldn't you mind your own business? This is our internal matter. At least I can say I was asked that question several times. So today we have deliberately invited an international panel to speak to us, and I would like to introduce them to you. Camilla Bocaniala. She's Norwegian, who lives in Cluj-Napoca in Romania. Camilla is a co-founder of Polylogos together with her husband Liviu Bocaniala. Polylogos is a Romanian association with a vision of shaping community by building bridges and investing in a new generation of leaders. Camilla is passionate about democracy, human rights, and empowering those around her to get involved in the political and social processes. Then I would like to invite Jyl Fallow. He comes from London, England. Jyl was the founder and director of a company that was owned entirely by the workers. Jyl also helped create the Magna Carta Institute, whose purpose is to analyze how best to create and maintain just societies that fairly balance both personal freedom and authority and the rights and responsibilities of individuals and society. Then I would like to welcome Jyl Hall Smith from Dayton, Ohio. Jyl worked for over 20 years at the intersection of academia and public policy. Currently, she works as a professor at United Theological Seminary. Her previous work with non-profit organizations includes World Vision, World Relief, and the Congressional Hunger Center, where she worked with multiple US representatives and senators to drive change in US policy, as well as provide development support in different parts of the world. She serves on multiple boards and has published extensively. And then I would like to welcome Heather Staff from London, UK. Heather is a political advisor on refugee and migration policy to UK parliamentarians. As a strategic thinker with a passion for international development and cross-cultural work, Heather works on projects around the world. She is also the executive member of a number of organizations and also a prolific speaker and writer. And I would like also to welcome Liviu Bocaniala, who lives in Romania. He's a Polylogos co-founder, and he is going to assist me today with Zoom and also with moderation of this webinar. And again, I'm Tihomir Kukolja, who will be leading you through our program today. So before we invite our panelists to speak, let me share a few House regulations. This webinar presentation will last for up to 90 minutes and will be divided into 3 parts. The first part will consist of presentations of the panelists that I have introduced a moment ago. Then the second part will consist of conversation and questions. And then the third part will consist of the final remarks and thoughts shared by the panelists. Due to the nature of the conversation and time limitations, we do not promise we'll be able to share all your questions or comments, which we would like you to ask in the chat box. And if anyone is watching via Facebook, you can also post your questions under the Facebook presentations wherever you are watching it at this time. We might not answer all your questions, but we'll do our best, depending on the time available. And for our Zoom guests, we would like to ask you to keep your microphones muted for the purpose of the quality of our conversation today. And now let us officially begin. And I would like you, Camilla, to be the first one and to give us an international perspective. For a Christian living in Europe, what are your observations, thoughts, and concerns about the current developments leading to the USA presidential elections? And if someone would ask you, Camilla, why should Europeans care? What would you say? Welcome, Camilla.
Thank you, Tihomir. Really, to be honest, when I was first invited to speak on this topic, I got very nervous because I realized that this is a very important and difficult topic. And also, I knew that I had to say yes to this challenge. So there are a few topics that engage me more and also lately make me more upset than when we talk about the intersection between faith and leadership or faith and politics. I have been watching with increasing concern as my friends and acquaintances on social media become more and more extreme on both sides of the political spectrum. Our conversations, our rhetoric, and our opinions have become very polarized. And they say this is an unintended consequence of social media algorithms and free market mass media, all of which profit from extreme headlines and disturbing narratives that make people upset and angry. And the COVID-19 pandemic clearly has not helped on this situation, as people have had less opportunities to air out their thoughts and ideas at dinner parties and a lot more time to feed their own ideas with like-minded YouTubers and social media influencers. It's a recipe for disaster. And all this considered, it's really not surprising that people no longer understand each other. So I would ask if we maybe have forgotten how to be peacemakers. And maybe we have forgotten how to be humble and how to have dialogue. When observing the type of man that a majority of Christian evangelicals in the US endorse so wholeheartedly, it does make me wonder. But this is really not about one man or even about a group of people. This is about a developing culture and a trend that I personally find deeply disturbing. So there are a few questions that I would like to address in this very small introduction, and I don't pretend to know the answers, but I will still take the opportunity to share some of my humble reflections with you. So first of all, I would ask, it seems strange to me, why are Americans so afraid of redistributive policies? Many Americans are clearly terrified of socialist ideas. Scrolling through social media, I see Americans using socialist and leftist and communist all mixed up together with other derogatory words such as corrupt and immoral. And it makes me very upset for two main reasons. First of all, it's obvious that they don't know what these words mean. And so they are contributing to spreading misinformation in a very hateful way. And secondly, it's clear that they see left-wingers as equally evil as those who are corrupt or immoral. And by extension, that must mean that they see people like me, who tend more towards the left, as somebody who is evil. And it's hard not to take that personally. So where I stand on the political spectrum really depends on the country in question. In the US, I would without a doubt qualify as a leftist. And many Americans might wrongfully go so far as to call me communist, which has happened. Meanwhile, in Norway, where I come from, I have generally tended to be more center-right. And so just in case some people are not aware, it is actually possible to have strong social security while also maintaining a strong capitalist economy and freedom of choice. All that into consideration, I can see that many Republicans have a genuine fear of communism and socialism. Considering where American politics is oriented, I would argue that there is much more reason to be concerned with fascism. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, I decided I will define these concepts for you. So communism is a theory or a system of social organization in which all property is owned by the community and each person contributes and receives according to their ability and needs. Fascism is a governmental system led by a dictator having complete power, forcibly suppressing opposition and criticism, regimenting all industry, commerce, etc., and emphasizing an aggressive nationalism and often racism. These definitions are taken from Oxford Dictionary and dictionary.com. So statistics from Pew Research Center from January of this year show that the overwhelming majority of Trump supporters in Europe are people from extreme right populist parties, all of which have a history of fascism and neo-fascism in the leadership and among supporters. So what does that mean? Does it mean that all Trump supporting Republicans are extreme right neo-fascists? Of course not. You know, we should not go to extremes like this and jump to conclusions like this. However, I still believe it is worth noticing, and it should give some red flags. It hasn't been that long since our countries were engaged in a major world war, started by a strong charismatic leader in Germany who believed in Germany for Germans. And we all know how that went. And maybe you're thinking, oh, that was totally different. But was it really so different as some of the things we're seeing today? Patriotism is a wonderful thing. I am proud to be Norwegian. But as soon as we start thinking we're better than the rest of the world, we're onto something dangerous. And when national pride becomes entangled with national identity that has to look and smell and sound and feel a specific way, it's no longer patriotism, it's nationalism. And nationalism, history has taught us, is a very, very dangerous thing. So I guess this is why many Europeans find it very strange when Americans raise their flags on any given day and exclaim USA, USA in campaign rallies and even in churches. Combine this with the fact that many Americans are famous for not knowing too much about other countries, it can easily come across as slightly arrogant. And just to give an example, we were in a conversation with a friend the other day, and he was trying to explain to us how in the US you have freedom of religion, while in Romania we do not have freedom of religion, apparently. And we, tried to explain to him nicely that we actually do have religious freedom in Romania as well. And he brushed it off, saying, yes, but I'm talking about real religious freedom. If it wasn't such a clear indication of ignorance, it really would be quite offensive. But why does it matter, right? Why does it matter what the world thinks about the US president? Why does it matter what people think about US politics or the US in general? Well, the reason why the whole world is paying attention to the US election and what is happening there is not because we love the drama, although maybe for some people that is the reason, but it's because this election and whatever is happening in the US has huge repercussions for the whole world. Over the last century, the US has been a beacon of light for democracy and human rights. Romania and many other post-communist countries have been looking to the US as an example for democratic leadership. Adding to that, for many years, American missionaries have been coming to Romania and establishing deep roots and strong connection with the evangelical churches here. So the US is not just a role model for democracy and human rights, it's also a role model for spiritual leadership. So when the US president, and in extension, everyone who support him, actively undermine peace and democracy, openly endorses dangerous conspiracy theories and extreme right groups such as the Proud Boys, and refuses to answer the question of whether or not he will step down if he loses the election, it does unfortunately have a major impact on people in other countries and what they will consider to be good leadership and democracy. So I would say once upon a time, the US was a beacon of light for democracy and human rights. Now it does seem like that beacon is fading. And people are worried, and they're right to be worried. It doesn't really matter if you're right-wing or left-wing, if you're Republican or Democrat. What matters is standing up for what is right. If you're a Republican and you see that your Republican leader is acting in a way that is offensive or destructive and even dangerous, it's your responsibility to speak up. Your silence tells the world that you agree with these behaviors and these attitudes and this rhetoric. Regardless of what side we're on, we need to hold our leaders accountable. Even more so if we are the ones who put them there. So lastly, I would just say, please be careful with your words. They say that words cut deeper than knives, and that is true. But sometimes words also lead people to using knives and guns and other weapons against each other. Breivik, the Norwegian terrorist who killed 77 people, mostly children, in 2011, was inspired by certain words and conspiracy theories that were being spread online. As someone with a background in peace studies, I am now seriously concerned about where this polarization might lead. The US is still a world leader. So I would say, please, for the sake of all of us, be a good role model. Take responsibility and hold each other accountable. Let's not forget that we, as followers of Jesus, are called to be peacemakers and each other's humble servants. Thank you, Tihomir.
And thank you, Camilla, very much. I consider this to be a very powerful opening of our webinar today. And as you are talking, I was reminded on a few situations when I was asked a question, why do I care so much about what is happening in this country, although I've been living here for, 14 years now almost. Still people considering me to be an outsider, some of them. I would tell them, when we had a mess in former Yugoslavia, 30 almost years ago, then we were hurting and we paid the price, we paid the cost. But when here you have the mess in this country, it's not only that this country is paying the cost, it is the whole world that is paying the cost. That's why we have every right to be involved and express our opinions and our questions and our concerns. So thank you, Camilla, again, very much for your brilliant opening of our webinar. And Jack, I would now like to go to you, and I'm trying to formulate the question for you. We know that a large number, not all, but a large number of white evangelicals, Christians, basically have made this presidency possible. And for some of us, this causes a number of questions because because there is a disconnection between the values that especially Protestant teaching represents and what the current president is representing. From observation, those two things do not go together. And I see here kind of a challenge of what I would like to call evangelical dualism. Maybe you could share the way you see this issue and the challenge of this evangelical dualism in America and the consequences that come from this too. And maybe you would also like to address a question about using Bible kind of being at liberty, picking and choosing the verses, combining them together, and then trying to create the truth that would support political ideas that are not complementary to the teachings of Jesus. So Jack, please, welcome.
Well, thank you, Tihomir. So dualism, many of you will be familiar with the notion of dualism. It's a term which applies throughout psychology, throughout philosophy, originally from Plato. If you've read the Cave, you have seen dualism. The form and the type are different. In the human mind, we quite often separate our physical body from our mind and imagine that they're two separate things. And dualism, even in psychotherapy, is a way in which we can split parts of the way that we see the world and the values that we have and chop them up and align other people with the negative version of it. If you think from Jungian psychology, the whole notion of the shadow side is one of the ways that dualism emerges, that everything we do which is strong has a shadow. If you're strong and confident, many people you see as arrogant and aggressive. You know, it depends how it is and how it works and how it plays out. So dualism's there as a general thing right across the whole of society and philosophy. But the difficulty that I think we currently have is that evangelical Christianity, and by the way, probably 70% of my history as a believer, as a follower of Jesus, has been in evangelical churches, you know, Baptist churches and so on. And of course, I now see the dualism there as being profound and often negative. Dualism in the church works different from, if you think of yin and yang, the whole idea of things being complementary and opposite. It doesn't work like that in the church. It works in the church in a way in which there's God positive, the devil negative, sinners saved positive, the unsaved, the unwashed, the unclean, the unchurched, all these people that we describe by un. We have this wonderful phrase, prefix we use to describe the people who are not in our tribe. They're un-something. They are not. And of course, that determination that people are other than us, for me, I can't find a place in Jesus's teaching where that's endorsed. I can't actually see the places where that kind of thinking actually comes up. And so the dualism becomes important because if you work on the basis of the outside, the non-person, the unsaved, when that moves into politics, then you actually exclude people and you see them not just as being people who don't agree with you, you see them negatively. They're people who are not, for example, born again. So how can they possibly have any value because they don't have that? Now, here's the problem. Most of the world doesn't believe in that kind of individual Anglo-Saxon Protestant method of seeing the individual as the dominant force in life. And of course, there's great value in that, and that being part of how people can see themselves. individualism and the accountability that comes from it. But when that becomes the dominant thing, then we surrender the community. We start to focus on how am I doing, and how do I know I'm doing well, and how can I get endorsement to say that I'm doing well. So, well, the prosperity gospel is very helpful for that. You know, if I'm doing well and the goods and the materials are coming my way, that's a kind of endorsement from God. So I'm okay, but that's just about me. Now, the question for society is, what do I do with what I've got? And one of the things that those of us who visit America, and I've been going to America for a long, long time now, people in America have very little sense of the amount of poverty which is visible to foreigners when they go to America. The poverty is so visible and so obvious, and the extremes between the wealthy people and the unwealthy people are very great. So there's a thing there. Now, let me just go back to, do I care about Trump and his current thing? Well, actually, Trump's just a symptom. He's an attractive endorsement of populism, and he's good at what he does. But frankly, if he was in, there are several countries in Europe with very similar things going on. I'm not sure that Bolsonaro or others would be particularly different if we actually, compared them there. They all use religion. They all use religion as a method. But here's a quote from a man. I'll tell you at the end who the quote is from. This man said, "It would disturb me." This is in February 1981. "It would disturb me if there was a wedding between the religious fundamentalists and the political right. The hard right has no interest in religion except to manipulate it." That's a quote from a man called Billy Graham. Okay. Now, why was that happening? Because in 1971, 74, 76, the Southern Baptists had looked at issues including abortion and decided that abortion was okay, and the rights of the women to determine what was there should be the significant determinant. But 6 years after Roe v. Wade, the famous case in America, under Ronald Reagan, there was a guy there called Lee Atwater. He was the boss of the Republican campaign, and he developed a thing called the Southern Strategy. And the Southern Strategy was really a smart way to use the Southern white nervousness about racial equality, but to abstract it and turn it into something. The real argument was about things like segregated schools, but they abstracted it and they turned it into something which eventually became the whole abortion thing, which moved from being a Roman Catholic driven thing to suddenly become an evangelical Protestant driven thing. Now, I don't think there will be a person on this call who thinks positively about abortion as a process. What I'm talking about here is the political work that was done on that idea. And so what happened was Reagan's Republican Party, with this Southern Strategy, Reagan was invited by the head of the Dallas churches, and actually by the #1 fundamentalist at that time, fundamentalist teacher. I can't remember if it was Criswell or Cresswell. Jyl, you might nod your head if you remember. It's Chris or Cresswell, something like that. Invited to the Dallas church, and basically they used that as a way of building up a whole new thing and flipping the South from being largely fairly democratic to becoming strongly Republican, but white evangelical Republican. And so there you saw the church being involved directly in a manipulation where the Southern Baptists really flipped They had 3 times at their conferences endorsed a view about something, but then they flipped politically and developed this. If you want to read this stuff, it's called the Southern Strategy, and the name of the guy is Lee Atwater. So that kind of stuff goes on, and the church gets involved in it. Now, if we set aside that part, because as I say, none of us are going to be particularly keen on supporting abortion, we get this thing where, what are we going to do? Because here's the problem. The world now presents young people particularly with incredible psychological burdens in ways which, I'm 72, in ways which were never the case when I was a youngster. And even as a politically active youngster, I wasn't worried about the environment. I wasn't worried about population explosions. I wasn't worried about all kinds of complexities. I wasn't worried about interracial things. I had a relatively simple life. Now, kids today carry enormous complexity, and they get it when they're in primary school and grade school. They get it from TV, they get it from children's programs on TV. They're more worried about dolphins. You know, I didn't know what a dolphin was, you know. But kids carry this burden now. And one of the best ways to manage a complexity is to develop a simple truth that allows you to sidestep it. A simple truth. So we can forget the science, or we can forget something, and we'll just go with a simple thing. And since I've used that example already, I'll stick with it. Being anti-abortion, well, there's a thing. We can actually go and we can vote for that. And I know what I'm voting for. I'm morally correct in my choice. And that's what I'm going to do. And so we get this thing where we suck in a simple thing, and it allows us to manage all that complexity and make life less threatening.
Thank you very much for that. And then let's now move to Jyl. But let me just say a few words, Jyl. There is this thing that I see coming repeatedly, especially through social media, that some very simple issues are being used as the major arguments for people to decide that they're going to vote one way or another. For example, I agree with what Jack said. None of us in this circle is happy with the abortion, and none of us want to be called baby killers. I was driving the other day here in Houston. I saw this big billboard. There was this picture of a baby, and the sign said, "Vote for baby." And clearly one knows where this kind of advertising going, what it was to say, as if the only thing that at this moment matters and the only issue that decides about who the next president is going to be is the issue of what is happening with the babies before they are born, however precious they are. And yet there is the whole complexity of issues which are just as relevant, and one doesn't really hear about them being taken as arguments leading to a decision, to final decision about who I'm going to vote for, at least for some people. I'm trying to formulate this question for you about going from this simplicity to actually embracing the complexity of life as it is, and then being, as a follower of Jesus, able to decide what am I going to do politically and who I'm voting for. Maybe you can address this, Jyl, and a few other things that you would like to share with us. Please, Jyl, welcome.
Thanks so much, Tihomir. Really happy to be here and really enjoying hearing from the other panelists, and excited to hear what Heather has to say as well. It's fun to be the born and raised American on the call, and so I have a lot to say. Just kidding, I'm going to keep it very brief, but really appreciate what everybody has contributed so far. You know, what's interesting, and when we were talking about the panel together as a group, it occurred to me that I remember in the year 2000, foreign affairs coverage in the media had gone down 600%, and that was in the year 2000. 20 years ago now. I've been really looking for a statistic that could say how much foreign affairs coverage has gone down since then, and I can't find it anywhere. I don't know if it's just not being measured, but it's a lot more. And Americans really don't know what's going on. They don't think about how our decisions are impacting the rest of the world. You know, some people do, but in large part, we're not seeing it in the media. It's, you know, 100% presidential election and coronavirus all the time, but that's been going on for 4 years as well, and has slowly diminished since then. What really bothers me is that people don't really know what's going on in our own country, and how, as you spoke to, the poverty that's unbelievable and the disparities here that's skyrocketing right now. And the problem that somebody can work full time in this country and not feed their family at the end of the day. Most people who are getting government assistance, if they can get it, because it's cut increasingly more and more, are working full time. And nearly all of them have been working in the recent past full time if they're not working full time. Right now, 54 million Americans don't have enough food to make it to the end of the month. Some people have to rely entirely on what's being donated. Unemployment is very high, and 1 in 4 kids are at risk of going to bed hungry every night in this supposed wealthiest nation in history. We like to brag about how rich we are, but for who are we rich? So I want to speak to the white evangelical vote in the United States, and I have 3 quick things I want to say about it. To piggyback on what Jack and Tihomir were just talking about is abortion. A lot of people say that that's why they vote Republican. Abortion is an economic issue. It really has a lot to do with what I was just talking about poverty in America. 75% of all abortions are related to poverty. And if somebody, in my mind, was really pro-life, they care about the baby after it's born as well. And it seems like a simple argument, but somehow, you know, this is not how people are thinking about it. If you were really pro-life, you would find that data shows that if you cut poverty in half, it reduces abortion by 30%. Data also shows that if you provide adoption assistance, reduce healthcare costs, fund domestic violence programs, fund programs to reduce unwanted pregnancies, and reduce childcare costs, which are unattainable and unaffordable for many women in the United States, especially single mothers, that further cuts abortion by 50%. So that's 80% right off the bat, right there. So why aren't evangelicals talking about that, about how we can really do something about this problem rather than be an exercise in judgment and the like? I have a few things that I think are Christian policies that people should consider when they vote. Support a living wage, support policies that make families stronger, if that's something that people care about, such as paid family leave, a carefully vetted and fair approach to welcoming immigrants, reforming America's unjust and racially biased criminal justice system that people are not unaware of internationally. We need to take on the threat that's posed by climate change seriously. That's something that affects every life on Earth. We need a plan to fight poverty in this country. And we need affordable health care. 45,000 people die every year due to lack of health insurance. And that statistic is before coronavirus. I don't know what it is right now. Another reason that people talk about voting for conservatives is they want Supreme Court judges that will overturn Roe v. Wade. Well, they got it. You know, it's 6-3 now with conservative justices. So it would seem that that may not be a reason to continue to support presidents on this issue. We'll see if they actually turn over Roe v. Wade, but I seriously doubt it. What was lost in that debate is that the Supreme Court also addresses in upcoming years environmental devastation, economic development that accounts for this widening wealth and poverty gap, the collapse of the possibility of affordable health care, and how we fund political campaigns. So, for example, does the government represent money, or do we represent the working class in America? If people are serious about caring about children from birth onwards, then they need to consider comprehensive solutions that address actual needs rather than this current deceptive merry-go-round that we're on. It's a travesty in the richest nation in history that women have to make a desperate choice out of fear of not being able to provide for their child, fear of losing their job, or not having proper health care for that child is unbelievable to me. And where is the evangelical voice on that? You know, if we put half of the political capital that we have in the abortion issue as white evangelicals, we could make a huge difference on this issue. Second, I wrote my dissertation on how evangelicals respond to poverty. And unfortunately, evangelicals are 3 times as likely to blame the poor for their poverty than non-Christians. And that's very much tied to ethnocentrism and racism and authoritarianism and the type of bootstrap individualism that Americans are famous for, which is really an egocentric individualism. However, I think it's important to point out this authoritarianism that is very closely tied to nationalism is growing globally, probably in response to globalism in the last several years. We're not the only country suffering from this nationalism, but we are certainly have widespread effects from our nationalism. The reality is that the majority of Americans are living hand to mouth. The majority. They are unhealthy with unaffordable health care and often in the position to make desperate choices, and that's being fueled by the white evangelical vote. So something is wrong with this picture. You know, we need to rethink how our Christianity is being done here entirely. Additionally, you know, we're supposed to be the group that cares about family values. So if we're basing our voting decisions on sexual ethics and family values, I really find it hard to understand the choice of President Trump. He's in the upper teens now of sexual assault cases, best friends with a convicted pedophile. It doesn't really make sense. Lastly, we really have to start sticking to the facts instead of rhetoric. If our public choices were really emphasizing biblical values while also respecting pluralism, there's no question we'd see abortion rates go down significantly. They've historically gone down under the last 2 Democratic presidents. And then we could also see an overall improvement in quality of life for US citizens and start being the international neighbor that we really should be and are not being right now. While we're talking about facts, another thing that often comes up is economics among evangelicals. And what's not said a lot is that the last time we really had a balanced budget is when we had a Democrat House, Senate, and President. Under Trump, our national debt has gone up by 1/3. We've added $7 trillion to it. And we have a real problem with facts and data. US Christians and having less ability to want to accept facts and data is also a part of authoritarianism, which is also closely tied to the fascism that Camilla was talking about. White Christians in the US are less likely to have the facts about what's occurring and statistically prefer to create some kind of a fantasy world to process this existential anxiety we're having in a rapidly changing world that, you know, many are reacting to with the nationalism. I would love to see the global church, which is outpacing the white evangelical church, which by numbers is going down significantly, really rise up and become the leaders, and minority churches in America become the leaders in what it really means to show the true love of Christ and what it really means in our public lives to bring those sacred held private values such as fighting hunger, fighting poverty, fighting against wage theft, and that's what it is, to the public conversation. Another example of putting out false data and kind of being attracted to the false data conspiracy theory that Christians have a tendency to is that coronavirus is a plot by the deep state to take away people's rights. who knew that this whole pandemic and actually wearing face masks would be a litmus test for somebody's character? In America, it is, in particular Christians. So all that's happened since 2016 has really shown the fruits of what's down deep in the roots of this type of Christianity. And I just believe that we have to not give into fear, and people have pandered specifically to Christians as a strategy. Jack, you're absolutely right. This was a strategy to target abortion, and it was a secular strategy. It wasn't a Christian strategy. The secular strategy in the 1980s was to gain the evangelical vote, which previously had been for Democrats, through abortion, which, as you mentioned, the Southern Baptist Church was not against at the time. In Proverbs chapter 6, it talks about 7 things that God finds detestable: a lying tongue, a false witness who pours out lies, and a person who stirs conflict in their community are things that God finds detestable. So people who believe in scripture and say that the truth will set you free need to be seeking for that truth and promoting the truth and embracing the truth. Christians should absolutely ask questions, but be careful from whom you seek answers. And we need to check our motives. I need to check my motives. You know, I need to dig into the data when I find something that motivates me and stirs me up. Christians shouldn't be the ones hating and judging and showing our arrogance with nationalism, judging the less fortunate and immigrant, particularly children in cages. Instead, we need to be on the forefront of advocating for the most vulnerable. Babies already born in the US, I would say, are the most vulnerable. And at the very least, if you're pro-life, you have to be pro-child after birth. Those are some of my thoughts on this issue, and I really appreciate being asked to speak and having this conversation with everybody.
Thank you, Jyl. As you were speaking then, I was reminded on an article that I wrote a number of years ago for the Huffington Post. And my line of reasoning at that point was, I am pro-life, but I am holistically pro-life.
Yeah, that's right.
Holistically means that the whole life matters, of the rich, of the poor, of the unemployed, of those who can make lots of money, those who cannot make lots of money, of the poor, of the immigrant, refugee, homeless, and we can go on and on with the list. They all come together under this umbrella of being holistically pro-life. So we can do much, much, much more when we talk about us being pro-life in actually protecting the life in totality. I agree with you completely. And now we go to Heather. So Heather, you're coming from England, and the situation in your country in many respects nowadays is very similar to the one that we have here in the USA. And you, as a politician in making, an advisor to politicians, you are very much familiar with the issues that are happening here in this country, in the USA, as well as in your country. I'm wondering if you have some words of, I don't know whether to say hope or guidance. Where do we move from here? How do we act with civility when it comes to the issues of as leaders and those who are following the leaders? Share with us whatever you would like to share with us at this moment. Please welcome.
Thanks, Tihomir, and thanks to all the panelists as well. I think what I'm going to actually say probably touches a little bit on all that you have brought out so well. And I wanted to start by a quote. It's always safe to start with a quote from, well, hopefully safe to start from a quote from a bishop of the Church of England. So I'm going to go with the Bishop of Salisbury, who recently argued that the health of society depends on the quality of engagement. And he went further to ask what happens when values of truth, justice, peace, mercy, and love are disrupted. Who he asked is calling that disruption out. And I think hopefully we've seen from the panel, we have some disruptors who are calling this out in a good way, but also have mentioned truth and justice have talked about mercy and have talked about integrity. And when Tihomir asked me about this, he specifically wanted me to touch on going forward post 2020 and around that truth and integrity, which can seem so lacking right now in a world that happens to feel at times like you are either being gaslighted or manipulated, called out, whether that's exactly like Camilla mentioned around name calling. Certainly I've been called some things around lefty or commie or whatever else you want to add, and unfortunately she's right, words do bring about action. In fact, here in the UK we've seen a number of cases of counter-terror cases going before the court relating to lawyers who are immigration lawyers because of some words that were said both from a Home Secretary and the Prime Minister relating to them being meddling do-gooder lefty lawyers, and we know where that can lead at times, and we see it obviously in the States looking at that. So I really want to look at the values we have going forward. So our panelists have mentioned things around the assumptions that we carry, the facts we deal with, and the truth. What is truth? What is our truth? What is Jesus's truth ultimately? It also argues calling out the very disruption that our bishop has just mentioned, and notions of legacy and rebuilding. Michael Weir, who is a faith advisor to Barack Obama, someone I follow and really enjoy reading from, asks us, he says, can we move away from a political spiritual harm? He argues that one of the ways that political spiritual harm does is by intentionally placing moral burden on citizens that fits the interests of political candidates, parties and activists, but doesn't fit the nature of politics, essentially, of the way we work together, the way we seek hope and change. And generally speaking, I hope that us involved in politics want to see good change. We care. I, just before I came on this call, got a horrible message about some children who were crossing the channel, some asylum seeking children, we presume, who drowned. And that's quite a hard thing to take on. It's quite a hard thing to understand why that happened right now in this day and age, you know, and looking at the comments straight away, horrendous comments, you know, migrant, criminal. Ultimately, as you know, Jyl said, they are children. Are we pro-life? Are we pro-child in that? I would also suggest, if leadership is about practical action and the duty of government is surely to protect its citizens, we've got to worry about legacy. What's next? What's coming? What are we actually building? What, as the Bible mentions, are the seeds that we're sowing? Can we handle perhaps the monster we might create in our quest to create a legacy or bring about the values that we're seeking? Are we aware of unintended consequences of decisions made because, well, it suited me at the end of the day? Or does it bring me closer to that seat of power, that seductive nature of power? Do we even agree on what our values look like at the end of the day? Are our values about justice, peace, mercy, and love? This morning, as is a very bad habit of mine, I checked my Twitter feed. I should probably stop doing that in the morning. But in doing so, came across a thread by someone called Clara Jeffrey. And it said, an ethical person wouldn't allow themselves to ascend to great power in an unethical fashion. Now, this was about this US Supreme Court. It was about people essentially selling themselves out to get something they wanted, or selling out a principle of law, of justice, of precedent, things that I believe in very much. It hit me hard. What does that look like for people of faith or none who are involved in politics? What does that mean for us post-2020? And where has some of the Christian church at times allowed itself to ascend to assumed, I'll say assumed power by unethical means? What about future accountability? And as I think Jack touched on, and Jyl and Camilla as well, you can hold people to account, and that's good, but you can also hold them to account for accountability's sake. Do we pursue an agenda? Has the church pursued an agenda at times because it feels close to that seat, because of that imagined threat that's been touched upon at times? And has it, in doing so, sometimes sowed more discord than, as Camilla talks about, peace? Has it been virtue signaling? We had a campaign here in the UK around free school meals, and a footballer took up the charge on that, and I happen to support this particular team, so I'm very proud he did that. But the Twitter feed was all about virtue signaling. They said, oh, he's just virtue signaling to protect children. He didn't actually. He was actually doing the thing he says he would. Virtue signaling would be like me going to say to you, I'm off to the gym right now, and just taking my bag and then hopping off to get a coffee or something. That's virtue signaling in that sense. So where are we going? Where is the church? Where is politics going after 2020 or even now? Are we going to just be virtue signalers? Are we going to pursue power for power's sake? Are we really all about ambition? Now, Deuteronomy 16:20 says, justice, justice shall you pursue. It's not a mistake. It does say it twice, justice, justice. The call there looks at heaven and earth, but also action and motive. If you talk to any Jewish person, they get this. They always say justice, justice. And I remember sitting in a meeting about this. We were looking at a migration issue, and a rabbi turned to me and he said, Heather, it's a justice, justice issue. And I said, what do you mean justice, justice? And he said, it's about righteousness. It's about what we do, and it's about what our heart is doing, that motive. Justice, justice. It's doubly important what the church does. It's doubly important how we act and what we say and what we do and who we hold to account. Perhaps the use of the word justice means that we cannot pursue justice without being righteousness. Righteous, as I said. Righteous, right relationship with God, right relationship with one another. It's not a single concept. And maybe we've lost that a little bit. Do we disrupt those who seek to undermine justice, justice? Do we call it out? Would this be a cry post 2020? In a word of a song I quite like, where do you want to go? How much do you want to risk? Are we looking for somebody with a superhuman gift? In a quest for legacy, how much are we willing to sacrifice? Are we looking for our little messiahs with those superhuman gifts? What is it actually we want in society? What would be a legacy for our leaders? Is it one where character assassination just takes primacy, or erosion of trust in experts and the rule of law? Is it a rule of law that we can pick and choose? Is it international law that we can pick up and put down when it suits us? Or is it about actually loving and caring and looking out for our neighbor? So why was it the other day when I woke up with a total sense of relief and excitement when I watched the Prime Minister of New Zealand give her election-winning speech? It wasn't because, and I'm going to out myself here, I'm a member of the Labour Party and we don't win very much, but it was an excitement because of what she was saying. Let's not be torn apart by elections. Let's listen to one another. Let's go deeper. Let's learn to see the other's perspective. That doesn't mean rolling over, but it does mean doing it with due care and actually believing that one another is made also in the image of God. Do we go deeper? Can we question, where is the love? One of my favorite scriptures is Isaiah, and I'm going to come to a close in a moment and open it up for our debate that Tihomir will take forward. But one of my favorite scriptures is from Isaiah, and it says, you will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up age-old foundations. You will be called the repairer of broken walls and a restorer of streets and dwellings. That's great, but what happens when we don't all agree if something needs to be restored? What happens if we're not sure how to restore that? That's something we need to work through to go further. In a sermon by the Bishop of York, he looked at a positive from the crisis. He looked at that rebuilding and mentioned William Temple. William Temple became an archbishop, and he, during the Second World War, in the midst of rubble, in the midst of dissolution, he dreamed of what peace would look like and how devastated cities could be rebuilt. He was one of the moral architects of a post-war consensus that gave birth to a welfare state and to the National Health Service. A concept born out of devastation and crisis, so needed especially today. And I might cheekily add, in reference to Camilla, that there's nothing communist about believing in a healthcare free-for-all at the point of use. Will our rebuilding and believing and leading care for the vulnerable? Will we be seeking to save the oppressed and promote empathy and compassion? And because I love him so much, I'm going to end on the Bishop of York as well. As quickly as Christ sets us free from all the self-made constructions of separation, the willful pride of the human hearts that builds them up again, This is why the Church of Jesus Christ must and does confront division and oppression today. People of faith should embody moral and intellectual integrity, not cruelty, not power for power's sake. And I would add, nor set themselves up as any type of Messiah, but they should instead act as a nation's chief servant. Thanks, Tihomir.
Thank you, Heather. And thank you, all of you panelists. I don't feel that I have to say anything. I mean, I've enjoyed listening to each one of you. So many important things have been shared. I'm looking at the time now, and I believe we still have about half an hour of available time, counting from the moment we officially started with our program. And I believe that with our friends who are watching us, this is also fine. And I would like to divide efficiently this time, maybe in like 20 minutes of some discussion and conversation, and then 10 minutes for some quick final thoughts. And Liviu, I know that you have been looking into some questions, and I would like you to think about if there is something you would like to share with our panelists and ask them, so that we have a little bit of a conversation right now. And all of you who are listening to us now and watching, if you have a question or a comment, be quick and share it with us in the chat box, and we will try to include it into whatever the time we have left for our conversation. Liviu, I would hand it over to you, and maybe you can share a question or two with us. And then, yes, please, Liviu.
Yes, good evening. I'll go ahead and I'll open the mics of all the panelists. And I'll just jump in. I was listening to all of you, and I am taking quick breaths and throwing myself between deep depression and huge hope. Democrats trying to change Republicans, Republicans trying to change Democrats, none of them proving themselves, or very few of them proving themselves to judge themselves according to the truth, the only immovable essence, if you want. What can we do? It's my question for each of you, and I will address it to Jack because he raised his hand. What can we do? How can we help people?
Yeah. Well, one of the things, now some of you who know me will know I'm going to say this. One of the things we've got to do is we've got to recognize how complex these problems are and surrender the simplicity. There is an easy path which goes nowhere. And it's fundamental. And in fact, this is a critical part of even of individual psychological development, that if you don't actually grapple with the complexity of the problems that you face, you adopt short-term silly solutions which deal with something that's not really important. So I think one of the things that churches need to do is they need to grapple the complexity of this stuff. They need to get real about it, and they're getting real about it. Now I've got, oh, sorry, this is that's the person that I would work with on this. I'm an advisor to a church in North Carolina, and one of the things that happened there after the Trump election was we looked specifically at value systems, and the work of a man called Jonathan Haidt, and I'll write that in the chat box so that people have it, H-E-I-D-T, is really interesting for looking at this stuff, because he looks at the moral dimensions of communities. And, you know, for example, we talk about right wing and left wing. Well, when you look in authoritarian psychology, the psychology of authoritarianism, then the difference between right wing and left wing is right wing people believe strongly in a social hierarchy. They believe in the caste system. They believe in the monarchy. They believe in a whole bunch of things which are there as part of a social hierarchy, that people on the top are in charge of the people who are below, etc., etc. Whereas people who are left wing essentially believe in equality. And partly that's to do with the fact that the people on the left get involved in integrative complexity. They actually look at the challenges. So they notice, for example, that abortion and poverty and being unemployed and healthcare are actually all joined together. And so they work in that. And that for me is one of the things. And Jonathan Haidt's work, he looks at the moral foundations, and he looks at a set of values, care, the extent to which we care for people, the extent to which we are interested in fairness, the extent to which we're loyal to our group, the extent to which we're involved in authority, the extent to which we're interested in purity or sanctity, and the extent to which we do these things determines to some extent whether we go for a liberal way of looking at the world or whether we go for a conservative way of looking at the world. Now, these are just words and concepts and ideas, but you know, when you get a church discussing, well, what does that actually mean? What does sanctity mean today? You know, does it mean that we're all going to become nuns and monks? Or what is the story with sanctity? And what does it mean actually to be loyal to your group? Who is my group? Where is my identity? So there's a whole bunch of stuff in there. Churches need to get involved in this. They need to grapple with it and own up and expect their people to be adults and put away these childish, simplistic notions. I'll stop talking now because I can tell that I'm starting to shout. That's always a bad sign.
Thank you, Jack. The question remains, what can we do? Jyl, did I see you raising your hand?
Yep. Advocacy is one of the most important things that people can do. There's no discounting how much citizen response can change opinion on things, for example, abortion or gun rights in America. And as you know very well, Jack, Magna Carta gave us the beginning picture of what advocacy can do to change things. That's how we, you know, if public opinion and public pressure would turn towards what is right, and to not see things in these binaries that, you know, I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican. Do you care that 1 in 4 kids in this country are going to bed hungry or not? So tell your politician you care about it. If there's issues affecting other countries and you're in another country, tell your American ambassador or your own politicians. Write letters. It changes things. You know, the politicians are populist right now in that a lot of them are just responding to what the public is talking about. So it matters. You know, and then with these binaries, people use words like socialist to shut down the whole conversation as if, you know, caring for the poor is something socialist. I'm fully a capitalist. But that's not what is happening in this country anymore. You know, we've got socialism for the rich, and then the small businessman can barely make it. And it's this totalitarian economic system where these catchphrases are shutting down good debate and public discourse in a civil manner. So I just wanted to submit, I think advocacy is a really important thing to do on the issues that you're concerned about.
There is a question that came for you guys. One of the people who listen to us is missing the ability of the politicians to be honest, to admit their own faults. Is there any way we can help them do that? Heather, you work with a politician very closely.
Yeah, I was just about to laugh at this one, because we actually had a situation at work where an apology had to be followed by someone misspeaking, shall we say. So we've been through this process. I'd say the thing that helps politicians to be honest or say sorry is get off their back when they do say sorry, because you can misspeak, or you do something wrong, and then you try to clear that up because it's the right thing to do, not because it's politically you've been told to apologize, but you generally want to do the right thing. Then what tends to happen is, even when you've made the apology, you still get a mass pile on top of that politician saying either you should not have apologized, you should stick to your guns because it's against blah blah blah, or you should resign anyway because you're insert swear words, or oh, you're only saying sorry because you're a politician. So for politicians, you can't really win in that situation. It's a very difficult situation to be bold enough to stand up, and it happens a lot in our parliamentary chamber, where sometimes politicians are asked, did you misspeak, Minister? Did you misspeak? Would you like to rephrase what you said? Would you like to offer a retraction to that statement that you made in a committee? It's not very easy to do that when you have constituents, or now I'd say, Camilla touched on this earlier, the social media network or YouTubes or comments has made that really, really difficult. You can't actually make a mistake in politics. It's very, very difficult, because you also might lose your job. So how do we help politicians to be honest? Tell them well done. Tell them well done when they speak the truth, when they speak uncomfortable truths at times. Tell them well done when they're brave enough to say, you know what, I got it wrong, I'm sorry. I made that mistake, I misspoke, or genuinely, I didn't get the facts right. And speaking as an advisor, I can tell you that often it's often people like me that made the mistake. So we're the ones that will feed that information to, you know, whether it's, I don't know, a Republican or a Democratic senator, you know, or here it's a Labour MP, a Tory MP, whatever it is. They will have teams of people writing things for them. They will have people that write the tweets often as well. So be gracious a little bit as well, because often it can be someone like me's job on the line as well. Be a little bit gracious. Think about the people involved. Not all politicians are deliberately not honest. That's just not the case. Often they are dealt what they get given to speak. They are dealt the facts that are presented, and they move from there. Some are, I would say, it's not always, some can be pretty dishonest. And that's when we need people to call them to account. But the main thing I would want to highlight is, please be gracious. And when you do call someone out, rightly so, because they got it wrong, or they've said something that just isn't true, do it in a manner that's not abusive, that's not threatening. And that doesn't mean you ringing up their staff 24/7 with death threats or with threats about their personal stance. So yeah, the main thing, particularly as a believer, I'd say, please do it with graciousness and remember the people you're dealing with.
Thank you, Heather. I grew up under communism, and I remember it quite well, how it used to be and how it became. It was a great deal of suffering going on under communism. And when I mean that, I refer personal, people, individuals, and institutions. One of those institutions that was under lots of darkness and threat and death was church. Somebody from America is making the observation, she's afraid that in order for change to occur, it may require that the church in America, the believers in America, to experience suffering, because suffering has a way of making complexity very personal. And Mr. Allen is asking a question, is the church so desperate for affirmation and power that it will grasp any opportunity to get it, no matter how it achieves that? I just put these two question and observations together because I think it kind of makes sense. Any of you dare to comment on this? Mr. Jack?
Okay, I've unmuted myself. I think it's interesting. I think, I mean, some of us have been poor. I mean, this is one of these things where your poverty bragging rights are important. I did actually live in a house until I was 16 that had no electricity. The toilet was in the kitchen. It just sat there in the kitchen. So I think I was 26 before Isabel and I had a house in which we had a bath. So I've got some sort of knowledge of poverty, and it does alter how you see things. It really does. I mean, I'm not poor any longer, but I still carry the knowledge of what that was like and what the experience of it was. And I think poverty can be an enormously powerful thing. I sometimes wonder when I see particularly wealthy young church people flying across the world to help the poor people somewhere. And I think, you know what, if you gave the money for your flights to these people there, that could actually do a lot more good. But the reality is that often seeing the poverty, being next to somebody who's got leprosy, being next to somebody who's in a Roma community and is not accepted by society, perhaps these things actually have got powerful influences on us. And of course, America's big problem is America doesn't go anywhere. Most Americans have only ever been to America, and most of them have actually been to their own state. So it's difficult to persuade them to see the world in a different way. I don't mean that dismissively. I just mean I've spoken to so many of them who say, oh, it'd be wonderful to visit London. You know, I've got a weekend in February. You know, they're going to become Londoners and Fiddler on the Roof or something like that. I don't know what they're going to do, but go and see two musicals and that'll be their visit. It's difficult. I actually would like to say something else. One of the difficulties for leaders, and this is true for Christian leaders as every other leader is, it's important what happens while you're present, while you're there. But what's also important is what happens when you're not there. The legacy you leave, the debris that you leave behind. And that's either gold or it's lead. And unfortunately, you can see in some of the modern leaders, and particularly some of the people, there's a chap who's one of the world's, in fact, I think he is currently the world's richest Christian minister. I think his name's Pat Robertson. Have I got the correct name? And he's just announced that if Trump is going to win this next election, and after that there will be the end times. Right? Now, this is a man who speaks all over the world and has got a giant God TV network thing. Is that gold or is that lead? I just worry about these things. I really do worry about them. No, and one last thing, and then I'm going to be silent. One of the problems is that America is angry. I mean, Pew Research did a thing in June, and I think they worked out that 71% of Americans declare themselves to be currently angry. We have the same kind of thing going on here, but for different reasons, in the United Kingdom, but for different reasons. But that anger comes out in terrible ways. And one of the things that saddens me, and I've seen this at close range in my own direct experiences, even something like Black Lives Matter, which should be an enormously ennobling change in social awareness, is to some extent being driven by people who are angry at the way that they've been treated. And somehow turning that into something that is a healing love is a really, really enormous challenge for people. And I just find it difficult. And in my own direct connection with the movement and with people who are working on it in the jazz world, so much of what's happening now is based on their anger and resentment at the fact that in the music world, somebody's had their knee on their neck for their whole career. And turning that into something positive is a really, really tough challenge. America's got a lot of work to do.
About the church, you know, it could be that there's dark days ahead for the church, but these numbers I was talking about, 54 million Americans struggling with hunger, white evangelicals are among that number. There's also white evangelicals who are living hand to mouth who still vote for Trump. And what you see there is the hegemony of belief, you know, that's preceded revolution historically. And, you know, in the past, the majority will go along with the belief set of the elite until they decide it's not working for them anymore. And that anger is really that beginning buildup of potential serious and current serious problems, but it's being directed the wrong way, you know. I have taught a class at seminary and invited somebody from the persecuted church in China to speak. And this is a church where people are tortured and imprisoned for believing in Jesus and not subscribing to the state church. Or another example of actual Christian persecution would be in India, where pastors are being killed regularly for their belief. And he was talking about the things that people are experiencing in the underground church in China and saying, I can't believe when Americans tell me they're being persecuted in the church. And right afterwards, somebody said, yeah, we are being persecuted because so-and-so and such doesn't like what I think. And that is one of the, next to abortion, this idea of religious identity and religious persecution, and I'm not putting it in the right words as it's being religious freedom, that Camilla was addressing. People really believe that somehow they're being persecuted when people are just critiquing the way that they're expressing their social beliefs. And the fact is that white evangelicals have all the political power right now. So how in the world could you say you're being persecuted in the face of actual persecution? But, you know, I hope the pressure doesn't have to continue to increase for people to start finding out the truth, and then you mix in, you know, all the false information, and it's not good.
Thank you so much, Jyl. We're coming to the end of our question session. Republicans arrest the right to be Christian in America. They themselves are very surprised, and people are very surprised when they discover that gay endorsing, abortion endorsing Democrats can also have a real faith in Jesus. And the question is, and I'm going to address it to Camilla, how should our Christian faith inform and guide our political and social decisions and actions?
So yeah, how should our faith inform our decisions when it comes to politics, when it comes to voting? There's no clear-cut answer as to who we should vote for, because there will never be a party or a person that will perfectly align with what we should aspire to as believers, as followers of Jesus. We have a standard that is too high. And yet, I believe that the Bible gives us some very clear guidelines as to what we should prioritize and what is important. Of course, it's different how you interpret that. It can vary, and it also depends on the context. I think one of the challenges in the US is that there are only two parties, and the person of the president has enormous influence. So in other countries, for example, in Norway, where I come from, or here in Romania, we vote for parties, and there's many parties. And then within these parties, there are certain leaders and they become the prime minister and all these representatives. We don't necessarily vote for the person, we vote for a party program, or that's how it should be, ideally. So one of the challenges I see in the US is that, for example, even if you would agree with the Republican Party program, could you really endorse Trump as your leader? And I see this as a real challenge for Christians, for believers, because we are accountable for whoever we put in charge. You know, we need to hold them accountable and make sure that they're actually representing us. And if people think that Trump is a good representative for the church and for Christians, then I will be very surprised. But that is a whole other topic. But I think we do need to see beyond just single issues, like many of you already touched upon. We need to see the complexity. And because we have the faith that we have, I believe that we have been given the spirit of wisdom and discernment. And I do believe that we can see complexity if we try to. So to me, it's a matter of choice, whether or not we choose to simplify things to a level where we can feel good about our choices, or if we choose to actually listen and learn and go deeper and understand that there are many priorities, there are many challenges, there's a lot of pain, and we need to deal with all of it. We cannot extract one thing and say, this is the most important thing and nothing else matters. I don't care, regardless, whoever else might suffer, this is the only thing that matters. We simply cannot do that, in my opinion. So that's what I would say to this.
Thank you everyone. Thank you, Liviu, for leading us to the question period, and to all of you responding really in what I consider myself in a beautiful way. I'm looking at the time now, and I know that we need to be finishing very soon. What I would like to ask each one of you now, just briefly, in a minute, if you can do this, going back to what Heather was leading us to at the end of the first part, and I would like us to go also towards the end with the same thoughts, and this: what now? What's next? Whoever wins, whoever gets the elections, how do we move forward? So please, each one of you, if you can deliver a very brief response to this as a form of your closure, and then I will say a few more words, and then we will be bringing this webinar to conclusion. So whoever wants to be the first, please feel free, feel welcome.
I would encourage Americans to vote, and I have the pleasure to serve on Biden's faith-based advisory team, and so I see him as the one most representing biblical values. So I would encourage them specifically to vote for Biden, and for the health and future of our country and for the love of our neighbors.
I would actually like to end with Proverbs 15:28. It says that the heart of the godly thinks carefully before speaking. The mouth of the wicked overflows with evil words. So I would just like to reinforce that your words matter. The church, our communities of believers should be different and better because we have a spirit that is not of this world. And there will never be a political party or a political leader that is perfect for us. But we need to be humble and patient and kind when we talk about politics. We all make assumptions. We all tend to think we know best. We have a lot to learn from each other. And perhaps somebody that you would consider as communist or extreme leftist might have some thoughts that are worth considering, or maybe somebody you consider to be a nationalist of the worst kind might have a story that is really worth listening to. So I would encourage you to find people you disagree with and have open conversations with them. Listen and try not to jump to conclusions. Listen and try not to revert back to the same rhetoric and simple slogans because they only alienate and divide us. Keep an open mind, try to understand, and I mean really understand. We're not first and foremost political opponents. We're brothers and sisters, and we share the same Father and the same Spirit. And if we do this, I really believe we can change the world.
Thank you, Camilla. Jack, would you like to be the next?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm going to say something I've said before. The world, the cosmos, the everything is incredibly interconnected. And every young person knows this intuitively. They wander around with it in their head, and then the church tries to tell them that it's something different to that by splitting things into this dualistic thing. So please, let's get a hold of the fact that we are one. I mean, as Paul says, we're all joined on. You don't know whether you're a hand or a foot. You sometimes hope you're the brain, but you actually might be the earlobe. Or the elbow or something like that. But we're all joined together in ways. And I have read about one organization in America called Braver Angels. And they, Camilla, are doing what you're talking about. They're working on how you build that discussion across the boundary. And that's one of the things that I'm quite keen on. It started there because the division is so deep. But I think there'll be a lot to learn from what's happening there as they try to do that. Thank you, Tihomir.
Thank you, Jack. And Heather, please.
Yeah, I would simply say, let's not isolate ourselves or one another. The world is interconnected, it's global, and as has been said, it's incredibly complex at times. But complexity is not a dirty word. Let's not shy away from reaching out to difficult solutions. A manifesto is wonderful, but it's not going to solve all of our problems overnight. Plans take years to implement. They take investment and they take sacrifices. There's a phrase we use a lot in the UK sometimes called "not in my backyard." I can be caring, I can want to love my neighbor, I want to do to others as it's done to me, but I'll say, but not in my backyard. In your backyard, you've got the bigger garden, right? Your backyard. What's going to cost me? But it does cost. It does cost to love our neighbor, and it does cost to do to others as we would have done to ourselves. And that's what we've got to keep thinking about when we vote, when we look at our leaders. And we need to keep remembering we are interconnected, and that simply justice will cost, but it is worth it.
Thank you, Heather. Again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Camilla. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Jyl. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Liviu, for really a rich conversation today. And thank you, all of you participants who have joined us and who have been faithfully listening to this 90 minutes, maybe 90 minutes plus webinar today. You might agree or you might disagree with some of the parts of something that has been said. That's all fine. We do not look at the things in the same way. But I believe at least that we are all living this place in a way, if I can modestly say, as better people, more informed, and maybe at least with some material to think about as we are making some of our final decisions leading us to the elections next week, unless you have already finished your voting. Nevertheless, whatever comes after that, there has been plenty said that should give us some material to think and reflect and maybe make even some decisions. We are planning to have some new webinars coming, maybe on average once a month, God willing. We will let you know, and we would like to see you coming back. Meanwhile, I can only say, may God bless all of us and all of you, and may we move forward in faith.